Welcome to the global implications of the Africa-China engagement. We're happy to have all of you. As you know, we have our keynote, and then there's lunch, and then there's a panel after. It will be wonderful if all of you can join us for everything, including lunch. Let me welcome everybody again in the name of our Dean, Dr. Francine Edwards, the Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, who was unable to be here. So I welcome all of you in her name. This program is being organized by the Global Societies Program and the Africana Studies Program. Clearly, we have global implications for both. And we have a wonderful speaker lined up for you who transcends many different borders, and as you would see. So welcome, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my partner and colleague, Dr. Donna Patterson, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. It's good to see all of you here this morning. So today we have Howard French, who's visiting us. He's actually been on campus before. He was here for Mass Comm Day last year. Howard French is a professor of journalism at Columbia University. He's also a journalist. He's been a journalist for many years. He's worked for the New York Times. He's worked for the Washington Post. He's been based in Africa, China, Japan, and also other parts of the world. He's written about Africa. He's written 2 books about Africa specifically. His most recent book about Africa is called China's Second Continent, which looks at Chinese expansion on the African continent. And his most recent book that was printed, I believe, last year is Everything Under the Sun, which looks at Chinese, kind of the history of Chinese expansion globally. So today he will talk to you about some of his work. So please help me in welcoming him to DSU.
Thank you very much, Donna, and thank you also to Akwasi. It's really wonderful to be back here. I hate podiums, so if I look uncomfortable, you'll understand why. It's mostly because I'm so tall. But it's great to be back at Delaware State. I do quite a lot of public speaking related to my books and my writing, and I take the opportunity to speak at HBCUs as something to be treasured and something of very special importance. And I hope to make clear to you, in some ways directly and in others hopefully indirectly, why that's the case. I'm here to talk mostly about not my most recent book, Everything Under the Heavens, which Donna mentioned from last year, but my book from 2014 about China and Africa explicitly. And I want to do 3 things. I want to tell you how this book came about, and I want to try to tease out of that story something that I hope will be of relevance to you and to this very special audience. Then I want to speak to what I found in the research and reporting of that book. And then finally, I want to speak, time permitting, and I'm going to take off my watch so I can monitor the time. Time permitting, I want to talk about what sorts of broader conclusions I've drawn since the work that I did on that book. And my thinking has progressed quite a bit since that time. So I'm going to try to squeeze in quite a bit. This might be 3 talks in one, but I'm going to try to get it all done. Just give me 1 second and let me set up here. So the story of this book, China's Second Continent, which is about China's push to engage with Africa, which begins, as I recount it, in the mid-1990s, or perhaps a little earlier, in the early 1990s. is, in a personal sense, really a story of biographical accident. I graduated from college a million years ago, and when I graduated, I decided to spend the first year after college overseas, sort of finding myself, deciding what I wanted to do with my life. And I decided to go to West Africa. And I went specifically to a country called Ivory Coast. And the thought was, I'll live there for a year, I'll think about what I want to do, and hopefully I'll have a brilliant idea. But if I don't have a brilliant idea, something that really inspires me, I'll perhaps apply to law school and go to law school. And this is kind of a very typical American educational story, that lots of people who end up going to, first of all, lots of people who graduate don't have a very clear sense of what they want to do yet. And secondly, lots of people who don't know what they want to do yet end up applying to law school. So don't be fooled by lawyers thinking that they had it all worked out at the very beginning. Usually, in fact, that's not the case. Anyway, I spent a year in West Africa, and I fell in love with the experience of West Africa and ended up spending 6 years in West Africa and discovering along the way this thing called journalism. Actually, I had been a reader of journalism for a long time, but I discovered an interest in doing journalism, which had not been anticipated, had not been something I'd done previously. It was not a focus of my studies in school. And I became a freelance journalist, bit by bit. This isn't a talk about my career, so I'm going to fast forward, just asking you to remember this notion of biographical accident. After school, don't know what I'm going to do, go to Africa, discover a love of journalism, begin practicing journalism. So there's two things under my belt, an experience of Africa and a love of journalism and the sort of beginnings of a career in journalism. Fast forward many years, the very last step in a career in journalism, I end up in China. As the bureau chief of the New York Times, living in China's biggest city, a place called Shanghai. First time working in China, and this is in 2003. And as the bureau chief, I had the best office, the best room, the best seat in the office. And what does the best seat mean? The best seat meant, by the way, bureau chief didn't mean a lot more than that, right? That was pretty much what it meant. I had the best seat in the office. And what that meant in practice was I had a view. And the view in my office sets up the next big accident, biographical accident. And I'm telling you all of this because I want you all to be attuned to two things. One of them is the opportunity that the world presents to you, not just your own society if you're American, but the world. And to think, beginning now, at this stage in your lives, to be aware, to be conscious of the fact that to the extent you are not open to what's happening outside of this country, to the extent you're not looking actively for opportunities out there in the world, not just limiting yourselves to career possibilities or conventional paths that appear before you right here at home, then you are depriving yourselves of lots of options. And so here I find myself in 2003 sitting in the nice seat of the bureau chief with a view. And my office was in a hotel and office complex in Shanghai on one of the major avenues of that city, very big city. And I begin to notice the arrival of automobiles, actually convoys of automobiles of limousines. And the limousines have police outriders, and on the lead car of the limousine there's a national flag. And because I had worked in Africa, I knew these national flags. The national flags I started seeing were the flags of African countries I had visited and which were familiar to me. This accident was the beginning of this book. So this was 2003. I didn't write the book till 2014. But this is what this accident, having worked in Africa, now finding myself in China, seeing by virtue of this set of biographical coincidences, the arrival one after another, week after another, of African heads of state visiting China, a light bulb turns on in my head, and I say, wow, there's something really interesting taking place between China and Africa right now. Nobody's writing about this. This is an opportunity for me. This is something that I can make something of because I've spent some time in Africa, and now I find myself in China. And so I started wandering out of my office and into the hotel complex where these heads of state delegations were setting up. And I began asking people, what's going on? And the answer that I quickly began to receive from them was that China's making this big push to engage with Africa, and that this is going to be a really big deal, and that these African delegations are really excited by this. And so I said, well, you know, I'm a journalist by that point, right? This seemed pretty obviously something that, to me, that to be noteworthy, newsworthy, and worthy of my individual attention. And so I began to research this bit by bit and to write about it for the New York Times after some time. And then finally, after I left the New York Times in 2008, to write about it in other genres, in other venues. I wrote first magazine articles about it as a professor at Columbia, and then finally I got an offer to write a book about this topic, and that's what brings me to you today. The lesson here, again, not to be too repetitive, is attentiveness, is openness, is thinking broadly about opportunities, of getting beyond your comfort zone, not necessarily, you know, taking the most obvious or the easiest or the most familiar thing that seems to be within reach to you as necessarily the best thing for you to do. And I'm not saying this because comfortable choices are always bad choices. What I'm saying this to you, the reason I'm saying this to you is because multiple choices, a breadth of choices, is always the best situation to be in. And you, as students at an HBCU, should think about the world as your purview, as your oyster shell, as, thank you, somebody noticed my head hit that. You all should think of the world as being, the entire world, as being a place of opportunity to you. And this is the way to set yourselves up to have the biggest gamut, the richest variety of choices for yourselves in terms of personal opportunities and career opportunities. So this is the situation I found myself in, and I don't want to claim, I don't want this to make it sound to you like I had this all figured out when I was your age. I didn't. There were accidents, but the key thing is I put myself in a position, I would understand only later, to make a range of possibilities open up for me that would not have opened up otherwise. And so that's what I want to leave with you all today, is to think in those terms. You won't know where you're going to be in 20 years. It's impossible for any of us to figure that out. But what you can know is that if you think about the world as being your oyster shell, then you have given yourself the chance to have those possibilities for yourselves. And that's a good thing. That's a positive thing. That's an enriching thing. The other thing I want to say before I get into the sort of meat of my comments about China and Africa and the world, which is what I'm here to talk about, I want to speak about something wonderful that I discovered as a writer I lived in China for 6 years for the New York Times, and since then I've continued to visit China on a very regular basis and to spend extended periods of time there. One of the, China, like any place, is a very complicated society, and China, like any society, has pluses and minuses, strengths and weaknesses, beautiful things and less beautiful things, right? But I want to focus on one of the beautiful things to help also kind of reinforce and set up this beginning idea that I have shared with you about thinking about the world as belonging to you, not just thinking about what is most familiar to you as what's accessible to you, but thinking about the world as belonging to you. Chinese people, everywhere I've been in the world, and I've been to over 110 countries, are striking for many things, but the two things pertinent to my remarks here with you today, for thinking about how connected they are wherever they may find themselves in the diaspora, meaning outside of their society, with their homeland. Striking for the degree to which they want to retain a pride in the place they come from and keep alive the connections that they have culturally, linguistically, et cetera, with that homeland. And so you go to Belize, a country in Central America, or you go to Uganda, or you go to Central Asia, or you go to wherever, and you find Chinese people, and you will remark consistently this set of attitudes of pride and connectivity and determination to retain their sense of cultural connection with their history, with their cultural background, etc. You, students of an HBCU, have the same opportunity, and Africa is the most obvious sort of nexus for this sort of thing. Africa is where people of African American descent come from, of course. And I'm going to talk to you in a moment about how Chinese people, how Chinese society, how the Chinese state, how Chinese companies began to focus on Africa beginning in the 1990s as a place of great opportunity in a way that I hope helps you think with the special cultural background that African Americans have, help you think of how Africa should be embraced as a place of special connection for you and of special opportunity for you. So 2003 or so, thereabouts, I see the convoys of African heads of state. I begin writing these articles. Eventually, I leave the New York Times after 23 years there. I join Columbia University. I write some magazine articles. I write a book. I want to talk to you quickly about what I found in that book project. And then I want to talk to you finally about the broader lessons that I've derived from this experience since then. So the spark of the idea that led to the book is wondering what's going on here, all these convoys. And I began to write a number of journalistic pieces at the Times and then later for magazines. And a lot of the early focus, not just my focus, or not even especially my focus, but generally the focus of journalism as people began increasingly to remark that China was doing big things in Africa, that China was really engaging Africa in a concerted way, with lots of energy, with lots of money, with the movements of lots of people. A lot of the early focus was really not so much about Africa. A lot of the early focus was about the West and about China, with two very broad schools of argument that one could identify, going back, over 10 years now. One of these schools of argument said that China is somehow taking Africa away from the West. That China is, this word wasn't literally used very often, but this idea was somehow conveyed, that China is invading Africa and is going to rip Africa out of the kind of embrace of the West and take it over. And implicitly, if you set things up that way, much of this coverage was also conveying the idea that this was a bad thing, that this was going to be harmful to Africa. The other line of argumentation was quite the opposite, which basically said, China is, the West has failed in Africa, the West had a long run in Africa, the West, of course, colonized Africa, the West extracted slaves, 18 million slaves from Africa, and has never really developed Africa, and China is going to develop Africa. This is new, this is different, this is better, and it's going to be decisive. And look at all the great things China is doing, and China is going to develop Africa. Finally, Africa is going to get developed, and it's going to happen because of the agency of this emerging superpower called China. So since I discovered for myself the China-Africa thing starting back in 2003 or so, until the time I wrote my book, these were the kind of prevailing types of discourse around China and Africa. And I was never satisfied personally, I feel comfortable saying, with either of these lines of argument. I was never persuaded that either of them was a sufficient explanation for anything really. But this is what the media seemed to be most interested in. And so as a journalist, as a working journalist for the New York Times, and then later as a magazine writer, I was forced to engage with these lines of argumentation myself, and I did my best to do so. Finally, when in 2011 or 2012, when publishers began to ask me, by this time, by the way, so when 2003, I see the convoys coming in to the hotel in Shanghai, and I, have these conversations with African diplomats and heads of state delegations. Back then, almost nobody was writing about China and Africa. By 2011, 2012, this is a huge topic. Everybody's writing about China and Africa. This is a huge historical moment. This is an incredible thing. This is of immense importance. And there are going to be one or the other, supposedly, of these historical outcomes. China's going to rip Africa out of the embrace of the West and do bad things to it, like not pay attention to the environment or destroy human rights or et cetera, or alternatively, China's going to resuscitate Africa, to revive Africa, to redeem Africa, and to finally help Africa overcome the legacy of Western exploitation, right? So 2011, 2012, book publishers started to ask me if I would be interested in writing about this topic, and frankly, initially I was largely disinclined. I thought, well, I have written quite a bit on this, and I have a curious mind, and I'm sort of restless of temperament, and wondered, do I really want to write a book, you got to spend substantial time, right? I mean, even if you're quick, you're going to spend 2 or 3 years working on a book project. Do I really want to commit that amount of time to this topic, a topic that I'd already written quite a bit about? In the end, the answer, you will know because I'm here talking to you, is yes, I decided to do it. But the reasons why I decided to do it had less to do with the particulars of the book contract offers that got made to me in the end, but more with my own kind of thought process, thinking back about what I had written on the subject, what others had written on the subject, and most especially what had not been written about the subject. And so book publishers make these various offers. I'm thinking about it initially. I want to say no. I commit some time to thinking about it carefully. I read through all of my notes from a number of trips in Africa to cover this China-Africa thing. And something begins to, at that moment, to sort of jump off the pages of my notebooks at me, and I sort of have a slap the forehead moment where I feel very stupid for not having paid sufficient attention or made sufficiently much of something that seemed now in retrospect to have been quite important. And the thing that seemed most important to me as I went through this kind of review process, thinking about whether there's a book to be written by me on this topic, the thing that jumped out of me in my notebook is observations here and there throughout many piles of notebooks. Journalists write in notebooks, so I have piles of notebooks from these trips. Observations that ran through the entire stack of notebooks, here and there, of seeing Chinese people in every imaginable setting that I had been in Africa over the last few years, and thinking carefully about, so my first visit to Africa, my first time in Africa was 1975. I had a pleasant drive from Wilmington here with my host this morning, who's from Ghana, and I didn't say this to him, but I thought to myself, wow, you know, I've been doing this for a long time, right? We were talking about politicians from the 1980s. My first visit to Africa was 1975, and so I started to compare my observations during this China-Africa reporting with my earliest experiences in Africa. And in 1975 and 1980 and the 1980s and even into the very early 1990s, you know, having traveled very widely in Africa, you didn't see a lot of Chinese people around. And so in the 2000s, by then, when I'm beginning to think about this again and have these experiences as a reporter writing about China and Africa, there's Chinese people everywhere that I went in Africa. That means in big cities, that means in small towns, that means in little villages, that means in roadside restaurants, that means pretty much everywhere. And so the slap my head moment was, nobody has really explained this. Nobody has really made anything of this. This is an opportunity for me. If I want to write about this, I can write about the human dimension. Forget the big, you know, headline style debate about is China good or bad for Africa. I can go and write about actually what's happening physically on the ground, what's happening in the real world of China-Africa. The movement of very large numbers of people in a very compressed period of time from one distant part of the world to the other. And there have been, by the way, on a somewhat smaller scale, but nonetheless on a significant scale, there has been the movement of Africans to China during this same period of time. But my focus, I decided, was going to be on the movement of Chinese people to Africa, and how this happened really in the historical blink of an eye. Beginning in the mid-90s, by the time I wrote my book, early in the present decade, as I said in the title of my book, perhaps 1 million, some people would say more, some people would say a little less, Chinese people show up from a base that was, not even a tenth of that, right? And so I could speak Chinese by this point. I knew the terrain in Africa very well. I'd been to pretty much every country on the continent and had been visiting Africa for all that time since the mid-1970s. I thought, this is the thing to do. And so the question I will try to answer, and my work really has come to involve in a way that I find to be very satisfying, trying to answer questions. So when I set off with a big project, whether it's a long magazine article or a book project, my primary goal, the starting point for me is devising a really powerful question that I can find fulfillment and fascination in trying to understand for myself. And the whole premise is, if it fulfills me and I can find answers for myself, the process of doing that, of finding these answers, will put me in a position to fascinate an audience. That's the entire premise on which this kind of book work proceeds. And so the question for me was, how did this happen? How did we get 1 million or 2 million or however many hundreds of thousands of Chinese people to go from China to Africa in such a short period of time? I signed a book contract, I got an advance, they allowed me to, gave me the wherewithal to begin traveling to the continent, and I spent a year spaced out over 3 different trips, a year cumulatively, traveling in Africa on the ground, 15, 16 countries, interviewing people, reporting, trying to answer this question. So how did this happen? How did all of these Chinese people, from big cities to little towns to roadside restaurants to wherever, how did they get here? There had been various theories about this in the press coverage up until that point, but nobody had really taken a human approach to figuring it out. Nobody had asked the question at the ground level. Lots of theories. Some of the theories were patently ridiculous. So one of the theories was that most of the Chinese people in Africa were prisoners, that China was exporting prisoners to Africa. That this was China's way of getting rid of prisoners and sending undesirables to Africa. Now, I said ridiculous, but actually historically that's not quite as ridiculous as it might sound. This is not the case, by the way. The Chinese people in Africa are not ex-prisoners by and large. There may be a few, but generally that's not the case. The historical thing you have to remember is that's how Australia got peopled, by British. That's how, part of North America got peopled that way. That Britain and other European countries actually had a history of sending undesirable people out of their countries. And so that was one of the starting theories. Another theory was that the Chinese state is giving Chinese people money and basically commanding them to move to Africa, that this is a gigantic state-run scheme to engineer the large-scale movement of peoples from China to Africa. And if one presupposes a big state-run scheme, then you have to wonder what the purpose is. And the people who had this sort of theory then further theorized that the reason was that China, this is all part of this China is trying to take over Africa idea that I mentioned before, that it's going to rip Africa away from the West and take it over for its own purposes. So I began to spend a year in Africa, traveling on the ground, talking to Chinese people, talking to Africans in whose midst these Chinese newcomers arrived, and very quickly developing a sense of what was happening that differed greatly from these kind of received ideas, these received pictures. And I'm going to be quick about this because I want to move to the bigger picture stuff about what does this all mean for today's world and how might this affect the way you think about opportunity in the world and your possibilities career-wise, et cetera. But the story of how these people began moving on such a large scale is in itself inherently interesting. And I don't just say that because I wrote a book about it. In the first country I visited, a country called Senegal, which is at the western tip of Africa, I began to interview. I chose Senegal because I knew it very well. My brother had lived there for many years. I had been visiting there almost as long as I had been visiting Africa. I spoke French. So I chose Senegal. I wanted to start the book project in a place that would be familiar to me. So I chose Senegal. I go to Senegal. This capital's called Dakar. And I begin interviewing Chinese people, and very quickly a story starts to emerge from people who Chinese people who didn't know each other. So this couldn't have been a coordinated tale, right? I'm approaching random Chinese people. And they begin to tell me, first of all, many of them, disproportionate number of them, were from a single province in China, a province called Henan. China is a huge country, 1.3 or 1.4 billion people. Henan is one of the biggest provinces of China, meaning 100 million or so people. But nonetheless, it struck me as odd that so many people that I was meeting were from this single place. And so I started asking them, what's the deal between Henan and Senegal, or Henan and Africa? And the story that they began to explain to me becomes quite decisive in how I how I subsequently began to kind of unlock the story of this huge human movement from China to Africa. So these first interviewees, the very first people I began to speak with, started telling me stories that went sort of like this. In the mid-1990s, a company from Henan, a provincial construction company, meaning the provincial government of Henan, owned a construction company which won a contract to go to Senegal to build a new national stadium in the capital city. The capital city's name is Dakar. And so several hundred Chinese workers from Henan province, the construction workers, showed up in Dakar in the mid-1990s, and over the space of a couple of years built this national stadium. Now think about who builds stuff. Where do construction workers come from? What do they do? What is their socioeconomic background? So construction workers are people who pour cement, they are electricians, they are plumbers, we call these trades. They're people who do a variety of trades, right? Several hundred of these people are sent by the Chinese state on contract with a duration of a couple of years to go from central China to West Africa to build a national stadium. And tradespeople in America, generally speaking, and I don't say this to condescend in any way, Americans in general don't know much about Africa at all, right? And so tradespeople are in fact typical, right? I'm going to say tradespeople also don't tend to know much about Africa, right? Chinese trade people also don't know much about Africa, right? All of a sudden, you see these working class construction workers, tradespeople show up in Africa, in a country called Senegal, to build a national stadium. They're on a 2-year contract. And they show up with the very sort of typical stereotypes that people who don't know much about Africa have. What are the stereotypes of Africa? Perhaps you all have stereotypes of Africa. Think about it. Okay? So I'm going to, just in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of spit out a few, right? So you don't know much about Africa, you have this vague image of Africa in your mind. What's that image consist of? Africa's really hot, right? Got to be really hot. Africa's really poor. Africa's really dangerous. A lot of sickness and disease in Africa. A lot of wildlife in Africa, right? These are kind of very common prevailing stereotypes of Africa and underlying stereotypes. And so these tradespeople show up in the mid-1990s. They'd never been to Africa before. They came from central China. They'd never been exposed to anything about Africa before. China's not a thing yet. All they have is stereotypes. They set up at a work camp several miles away from the site where they're going to build the stadium. They take a bus from the work camp where they live to the stadium construction site very early every morning. They're brand new to Africa. They just arrived, and something powerful begins to happen in their minds right from the very first day. So remember, it's Dakar, Senegal. Dakar, Senegal, much of the year has a Mediterranean climate. In fact, it gets cold in Dakar. So Dakar's not hot. Well, it can be hot, but it isn't like the Africa hot they imagined, right? Dakar is beautiful. They thought, you know, it was going to be run down, just overwhelming poverty, probably bad smells, you know, just decay, right? Dakar is a nice-looking city. Big, nice-looking seaside city, right? So their stereotypes begin to explode, right? There's no lions and tigers and bears running around in Dakar. It's not wildlife in Dakar, right? It's like well-dressed people in a good-looking city, right? Stereotypes out the window, right? There's no epidemics of any, you know, notable kind in Dakar. Sure, people die everywhere, right? But it's not like people are dropping, you know, by disease on the street in Dakar, right? So all the stereotypes disappear. And then they begin to build the stadium, and they discover a variety of other things. First of all, the sky looks blue in Dakar much of the year. The sky doesn't look blue much of the year in most places in China. It looks awful. It's very polluted in China. They're thinking, wow, how could they have so, this is like incredible, blue sky, like every day. And they're thinking, on the bus ride from the work camp to the work site, they're thinking, there's all this green land here. And guess what? But from the perspective of people who come from central China, province, a single province with 100 million people, they're thinking, how come this green land is empty? It's not like, it's not, you know, people fighting over it. It's not densely populated, which to a Chinese person without any background in Africa sounds like an opportunity. Like, there's this green land. Green means irrigated, whether by rain or whatever, under a blue sky, not a lot of people on it. They're thinking, if I could have a chance to do something with land like this, I could probably make something of it, right? And so these tradespeople show up in Dakar in mid-1990s. They have their stereotypes exploded. They find out that Senegalese people are not just well-dressed and cultured, but they're friendly. So Africa starts to seem really quickly like a nice place. The Africa that had these forbidding stereotypes begins suddenly, in exposure to the reality, to seem like a nice place. What does a nice place mean, among other things? It doesn't just mean pleasant. For many people whose brains are switched on in the right way, it means opportunity. And so lots of these tradespeople, they're signed up for 2-year contracts. They begin to think, you know, I could go back to Henan, this really crowded, really polluted, really hyper-competitive place in central China that I came from, where you can't get much green land and where they don't have many blue skies. Or I could bank all of my money that I'm earning during these 2 years and try to come back here at the end of 2 years as a business person. And so this is the beginning of the Great Migration. And I'm telling this story in a compressed fashion. I went through 15, 16 African countries meeting people like this. They're not all in every country from Henan, but the connection between China and Africa in Senegal was a Henan connection. And so I'm going to tell you why Henan continued to be so heavily represented in a moment. Anyway, the contract runs out, the stadium's built, 2 years are up, and who knows exactly how many, but some significant percentage of these people decided they like it in Africa. They're going to stay in it. They're going to try their luck. They're going to try to make something of the opportunities they see in Africa, in a country called Senegal. And so they wire back to China to have their savings, their banked salaries sent to them, and they start opening up little businesses. And this becomes, in Senegal, and then simultaneously, or in some cases subsequently, in many other African countries, the kind of engine that propels this migration through a process that I'm going to call emulation or chain migration. So how does that work? So if you are a plumber and your neighbor, you live in a working class neighborhood and your your next door neighbor or your daughter's best friend's father is a carpenter, right? And your children both go to the same school, and initially your daughter goes to Senegal, your family pulls up stakes and goes to Senegal. I mean, the initial reaction of the other family is going to be, they went to where? What? What's that all about? And a year or two later, you start seeing via the daughter, the daughters are friends, right? The carpenter and the electrician, or the carpenter and the plumber, right? The daughter, one of them uproots their family and goes to Senegal, and a couple of years later, their business starts to succeed. And next thing you know, pictures show up via the social media of the daughter of the family that stayed in China, of the daughter that's in Senegal that's starting to succeed and build a house. Maybe in the background of that house, you can see the sea, and it's under a blue sky. Or maybe there's a plot of land that's being farmed. Or maybe they have a store. Or maybe they have a couple of vehicles now. All of this means the beginnings of a newfound prosperity for that family. And so what do you think happens in a chain migration scenario, or in a scenario of emulation, when the daughter of the family that stayed in Senegal, in China, sees the pictures sent by the daughter of the family that went to Senegal? Daddy, Mommy, you got to look at these pictures. So-and-so, you thought they were crazy when they went to Senegal, but look how they're living now. They've got this nice 2-story house, or they've got 2 cars, or they can see view in their home, or blue skies over a green field, whatever, right? Well, the carpenters and the carpenter family begins to have this conversation. It says, the electrician family, they were nice people, but they're not more clever than we are. They're not smarter, more talented than we are. If they can make it in a place called Senegal, well, I think we can do it too. And so this is the motor, the engine for what I've called emulation. And the neighbors of this same working class background then begin to say, well, look, it looks like all we thought about Africa prior was that if you step out in the street, a lion's going to be after you, or there's an epidemic, or it's really dangerous, or everybody's poor, there's no business opportunity here. But our next door neighbor is thriving there, and so we're going to try to thrive there too. This becomes the engine, not some grand central government scheme that says we have to move 1 million people, not some demonic plot to take over Africa. Pure human envy and search for opportunity, and ultimately emulation, right? And so as I begin to go through 15 different countries, I see that similar experiences happened beginning in the mid-1990s, where a particular province got a contract to build a particular project in a particular country, and this emulation effect begins to take place as the tradespeople begin to execute these contracts in these various countries, and subsequently the workers, the population of that province begin to predominate in this new place of emigration, right? So it's Henan people in Senegal. In Mozambique, it could be Fujian people, that's another province, or in, who knows, in Ghana, it could be people from Hubei, another province in China, et cetera, et cetera. So the piece I want to leave you with is, why did this all happen beginning in the 1990s, and what does it mean? And I want to give you my sense of what it means in a very big picture sense, but I also want to leave you with a sense of what it might mean for you as individuals of your backgrounds and individuals at this particular time in history, right? So having used the word history, I'm going to resort to history and give you a quick summary history of modernization in China. So in 1976, from 1949 to 1976, the leader of China was a man named Mao Zedong. Mao was a revolutionary. Mao unified China after a long civil war and established the power of the Communist Party and ruled this isn't a political science class, but ruled in a pretty radical way for much of that time, from 49 to 76, including in a way that renounced capitalism, and which largely closed the Chinese economy off from the global economy. And so Mao dies in 1976, and in 1979, or thereabouts, somebody who becomes the next major historic leader of China establishes his authority, a man named Deng Xiaoping. And Deng, as Mao had long suspected, Deng and Mao were partners. Deng was a lieutenant or a deputy of Mao, who Mao kept purging. Mao kept punishing him because Mao suspected that Deng wanted to take China back to capitalism. And so Mao, being a Marxist, kept purging Deng on that basis. Anyway, Mao dies. Deng eventually takes over, and guess what Deng does? He begins to plot China's way toward some form of capitalism, just as Mao suspected. Well, so Deng does this in a very interesting way. The people around him, meaning the rest of the ruling class in the Communist Party, were conservatives. What does conservative mean in this context? Conservative simply means they want to keep things the way they are. That's what conservative means at its root, right? And so the way things were was radical Marxism and Maoism. Right? Mao's gone. Most of the old guys who are in the elite wanted to keep some degree of Maoism, or at least Marxism, and Deng wanted to capitalize the society at least to some substantial extent. And so many in the elite of the party were suspicious of Deng on that basis. So Deng had to be really careful. And what Deng did was, his answer was, I will gradually reform China in a way that won't overly alarm the people who might react against me or even overthrow me, by instituting a few experiments with capitalism. And the first of the experiments with capitalism was in a place called Shenzhen, which at the time was a little fishing village on the far periphery of China in the south next to Hong Kong. And Deng opened up what he called a special economic zone in Shenzhen, where the idea was that they will sort of fence off this area and invite foreign investment. Foreigners will send capital, foreigners will send machinery, and foreigners will send managerial expertise, and they will hire Chinese labor to produce simple goods. The goods could be simple electronics, or they could be textiles, or they could be sort of injection plastic toys, things like that. A lot of the senior leaders didn't want to do this, but Deng got away with it by putting it on the far periphery of China, and lo and behold, the thing really works well. The special economic zone takes off. It's making a lot of money. It didn't produce riots or destabilize the Communist Party in any obvious way. Deng wins the idea of increasing, in other words, introducing more of these special economic zones. Bit by bit, China creates lots of them, right? Fast forward. So that begins in 1982. Fast forward several years. By the beginning of the 1990s, the Communist Party's thinking very carefully about its medium and long-term future of the Chinese economy. And at the senior level, they have these talks in which they conclude that as successful as special economic zones had been up until that point, that to rely only on special economic zones would be a kind of poison pill for China. In other words, it would doom China to a stunted kind of growth. It would take China grow very fast, but only up to a certain point. And beyond that point, China wouldn't be able to grow very much more. And so they needed to figure out, already they believed, in the late 80s and early 90s, what would be the next thing. And the next thing that they decided upon brings us back to our topic of China and Africa. This historic, decisive political decision, political economic decision. And the decision was that in order to continue its development over the long haul, China couldn't just accept investment from other countries and have people set up factories in special economic zones. But China had to become an agent itself of globalization, meaning that China had to send its people outside, that China had to have companies of its own that were actors outside of China, that China needed to become an investor itself outside of China, and that it is these processes which are often sort of labeled under globalization, that China could best assure its long-term growth. So that seems pretty unremarkable maybe on the surface. But something really remarkable happens at this point, and this is the key thing for you guys. The leaders of China in the early 1990s, at a point where nobody in the West was thinking this, said, yes, we have to go out into the world. Yes, we have to become agents of globalization. Yes, we have to have our own strong companies. Yes, we have to invest in other societies. But the place we should begin doing this is the continent of Africa. This was in the early 1990s they made this political decision. This is astounding in the context of that time. What was happening in the early 1990s? The Cold War had just ended. Western Europe was turned eastward, thinking how to integrate Eastern Europe within the Western European sphere. The last thing Western Europeans were thinking about was Africa. The United States was thinking about all sorts of other kinds of problems in the world. The most important, eventually, would be terrorism and Islamicism, right? And the United States began to engage in lots of adventures and wars and conflicts in various other places. The last thing it was thinking about was Africa as a realm of opportunity. The Chinese alone were thinking that in the early 1990s, at a time when China was not yet rich and successful. China is thinking strategically. They're thinking for the long term. Why did they think Africa would be such a place of opportunity? Well, first of all, the fact that there was not much competition from the West or from Japan in Africa was important, because China didn't have much experience with global capitalism or with brand name companies or with foreign investment outside of China or with any of these sorts of things. But there are other reasons which are inherent to Africa, which are important for my story and which could be important for your stories. The Chinese having noted that Africa was sort of sitting there, neglected by much of the rest of the world, began to study the fundamentals of Africa, and they come up with some key conclusions. One of them was that at the time, in the early 1990s, Africa had a population of, let's say, 850 million people. China at that time had a population of 1 billion people. The Chinese began to think carefully about the demographics of Africa, and they said, and this was not a secret, by the way, there were demographers in the West and at the United Nations who came to the same conclusions, but only the Chinese seized upon this. They said, Africa's got 850 million people in the early 1990s. By the mid-2000s, meaning by 2050, Africa's going to have 2 billion people. And by the end of this century, Africa's going to have between 3 and 5 billion people. What does that mean? China is trying to become a manufacturing superpower in the early 1990s. This is really the beginning for China. It was not a manufacturing superpower yet, but that was its goal. So they're thinking carefully, where are the new people in the world going to be? Where's the marginal growth in the human population going to take place? And they say, everybody else thinks Africa's nothing. It's not worth bothering with. Africa's poor, Africa's disease, Africa's turmoil, Africa's wild animals. But the Chinese said, actually, Africa's people. And we want to make things to sell to people. And for the next 100 years, the new people in the world are predominantly going to be born in Africa. And so if we take a long view of this and begin engaging with Africa, we are, in a sense, creating a long-term prospect for ourselves, long-term opportunity for ourselves. The other thing that related to demographics that China noted back in the early 1990s, which conditioned these strategic decisions, is that alongside this spectacular population growth that Africa was just about to begin experiencing, Africa was also almost certainly going to become the part of the world that had the largest scale urbanization. What does urbanization mean? Urbanization means people leaving villages and small towns and leaving small scale agriculture and moving into cities. So why is this important? It's important partly because China knew from its own experience, was beginning to understand from its own experience, that urbanization, you have to do other things well, right? Urbanization by itself does not equal wealth, right? But when you do a certain number of other things well, urbanization becomes a really important motor of prosperity, of rising incomes. And so China's thinking, everybody thinks Africa's poor and hopeless, right? But Africa's going to have this population boom, and Africa's going to really urbanize faster than, on a larger scale than any other part of the world. We think that means that if certain other things happen, at least in a variety, everybody's not going to succeed in Africa, but at least in some number of African countries, if a certain number of other key things begin to happen, there's going to be a prosperity boom in Africa. There's going to be a lot of new middle-class people in Africa. What do middle-class people offer to China? China's a country that manufactures things. China's a country that exports things. China's a country that wants to sell things. Middle-class people like to buy things. People who just moved from small towns or the countryside to cities have to build homes. Homes are things. Homes need roofs. Homes need tiles. Homes need plumbing. Homes need appliances. People who are going to be urbanized in this way are going to buy cars. They're going to buy clothes. They're going to buy phones. They're going to buy everything that you and I buy. These new middle-class people. And so the Chinese did this really exceptional thing by way of a vision that they had in the early 1990s of seizing upon Africa as a place of opportunity starting in the early 1990s at a time when the rest of the world saw Africa only as a blight or as a dark spot, or as a place of problems, or as a hopeless, geographic space. And the Chinese made a long-term bet on Africa. I'm not here to tell you, please do not mistake my comments, to mean that China is uniformly good for Africa or uniformly bad for Africa. I will tell you that it is good for Africa to have choices, and to the extent that more people, more countries from various parts of the world are engaged with Africa, means that Africa has more opportunities for itself. Africans, Africa is 54 countries, that Africans have more opportunities for themselves. Having partners, each partner brings his or her own problems, right? But having partners is another way of saying having opportunity. And so China has shown up, and that represents opportunity for Africa. The key point, though, the final takeaway is that China understood Africa itself as a keystone opportunity for it to carry its development beyond the special economic zones, which had been the initial kind of impetus for China's economic takeoff, to the next step that would carry China into broad prosperity, its own big middle class. And so that's what's happened since the early 1990s until now. And the personal note here for you with which I'd like to conclude is that if the Chinese can see Africa as a place of opportunity, surely an audience like this should be able to see Africa as a place of opportunity. You would be remiss, in my view. I would never tell individual A, B, or C they need to get to Africa right away. But as a group, you all would be really, really compromising your own possibilities by not thinking about Africa as something vital to your experience, as something that you really need to know about, as a place where you should think of in terms of the opportunities it presents. Not necessarily because you have to end up there, but because it's a normal part of the world. And the Chinese people have discovered this to their own benefit, and therefore, so can a switched-on audience like this. and so should a switched-on audience like this. So I'm going to stop there. I understand there'll be questions, and I really appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Okay, we're opening the floor for questions. Yes.
Do you need the microphone?
Hello. I have a couple questions, but my name is Cassidy Little, and I'm a junior, and I just wanted to get a clearer understanding because I'm not sure if you got the chance to see it, but the way that the video presented basically the Chinese presence in Africa was like it was a deliberate, widespread movement from the government or organizations like that, but the way you just presented it is just individuals seeking opportunity. So I wanted to know, when did that shift sort of happen between just individuals seeking opportunity and it becoming like a deliberate, widespread movement, and if you think that that's what it is?
Sure, thank you. You're right, I didn't see, I just saw a few minutes when I first got in of what was playing here. Let me be clear. I think that the Chinese state had a very deliberate policy of engaging with Africa for the reasons I described. And they had this consultation at a high level of strategic kind of economic design, policy design, that began in the late 80s and concluded in the early 90s, which said China must go out into the world, that having people just relying on investments coming into China and setting up special economic zones would be a dead end for China, that China had to go out into the world to seek business and opportunity for itself. That was a very deliberate, super high level, strategic decision taken by China and executed with discipline. Okay? The policy, this was at a time when the head of state was a man named Jiang Zemin. And Jiang Zemin gave the policy a name. The policy was called Go Out. Simple as that. In the early 90s, Jiang Zemin, the president at the time, announced that the priority of China henceforth would be going out, that we have a policy called the Go Out policy. That's very well known by people who study China and who write about China. This is super well documented, right? Much less well documented is the Africa focus that I have dwelled upon in my remarks to you. Jiang Zemin, the president of China, at the very time when he said China must go out, said that China should make a special strategic focus of Africa. This was decided in, I believe, 1992, at a time when China was not yet rich and powerful, and when nobody really in the global community was thinking about Africa as a place of great opportunity. Okay? The Chinese head of state presides over this policy formation process and then begins to execute it. Where people make a mistake is in understanding that to mean that go out should mean that there should be X number of hundreds of thousands of Chinese people uprooting themselves from China to go live in Africa. The Chinese state did not decide that. The Chinese state, everything that I learned in the reporting of my book indicates to me that the Chinese state itself was surprised by the rapidity, the speed with which Chinese people began through this chain migration process I described to move from various provinces in China to Africa. The Chinese state did not, neither did it engineer that, nor did it explicitly encourage that, nor was it even expecting that, right? So there's two things. A state policy that says go out, seek business, engage the world, be a globalizer yourself. That's one thing. That was explicit state policy. And the other thing about human migration, which was a kind of accidental thing. when I was first writing proposals for my book, the working title of my book involved the word haphazard. I called the word, a working title was Haphazard Empire. And publishers didn't like that. They said, nobody will go in a bookstore and buy something that has haphazard in the title. They don't want haphazard. But there was a reason for the word haphazard, because the focus of my book was the human movement. And it was haphazard, meaning this is a byproduct that wasn't expected. The Chinese state didn't expect there to be 1 million people in the space of less than 10 years to go from China to Africa, right? So one thing is expected and pursued and executed deliberately, and the other thing happened as a byproduct that really was not anticipated at all. Thank you.
Are there other questions?
Hello. First of all, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed your talk. I really enjoyed it, particularly because when I graduated from college, what I did was go back to Taiwan, and that's where I lived in the Republic of China. And it's interesting because I went there in the 1980s, 1988 to be exact, and I was also asked to go to Shenzhen, which I went. I was working for a company at that time in the World Trade. It was the World Trade Organization in Taipei. And what was interesting, and the reason why I wanted to make sure that I asked you not only a question, but also to make a comment, this is one thing that's been very difficult, how to make the connection of doing business in, if you're working for Chinese company, and you're going to, say, work that same relationship and then try to use your networking from there to do business in Africa. How does one, navigate that? Because in my experience, I work with Chinese business persons here in the United States, but I could never make that connection as some of them would travel other places, because I've spent time in Africa as well, and I noticed that the change over time. And so I wanted to just see, what you thought, what were the thoughts in terms of business, and how people that are interested in business, how they can, benefit from all these connections.
Thank you. I'm equally fascinated by your question and frustrated by your question. And I'm fascinated for reasons I'll explain, but I'm going to tell you the frustrated part first. And the frustrated part is I'm not a business person. So I can't give you a very business-oriented answer to your question. The fascinating part for me, however, is that, like I said at the beginning of my remarks, I said something that was striking in a positive sense for me about Chinese culture is the extent to which Chinese people go to celebrate their culture and to hold their culture tight and to, keep alive cultural connections wherever they end up in the world, right? The business piece of that is that Chinese, and I'm speaking at the level of broad generalities, right? I mean, so there's every Chinese person not like this, right? But at a level of broad abstraction, Chinese people are great networkers, right? And this serves them well as they move about the world, right? And so for an audience that is predominantly African American, the lesson that I would encourage from this is first, get out there in the world, right? As much as possible, right? Get out there in the world. I don't care where you end up. I don't care where you live. I mean, I wish everybody success and happiness, first of all. Let me make that clear. But get out there in the world first. And as you get out there in the world, think about the importance of networking, right? And think about how networking means sustaining connections with people who share lots of culture with you. But also think about networking, and I don't mean to, I really mean that. That's important, that's an advantage to you, that just like the Chinese do, you should do that too. But also think about networking as an obligation to go beyond the familiar. In other words, I want you to treasure your own background and your own cultural specificities. But while you're doing that, even while you're doing that, you need to also be making connections outside of your own familiar circles, culturally speaking, right? And the more successful you do that in general, it's my belief, even though I'm not a business person, the better that will redound to you, the better that will help you as a business person. Whether you find yourself in East Asia or in Latin America or in Europe or in Africa or wherever. And you actually find the more places you go, when you have this mindset, the denser your web of connections becomes.
I want to briefly just make an announcement before we move on to our other questions. We're going to have lunch delivered soon. So those of you who are here, if you'd like to stay for lunch, you can stay for lunch. It'll be a box lunch. And at 1 p.m., we're going to have a faculty panel to continue some of these discussions. And so if you do have to leave, maybe come back or, invite a friend. We have a question here. And if someone else has a question, just raise your hand and I'll come to you next.
Okay. It's probably going to take me a minute to frame my question. So just to familiarize you with the video, it was basically about the different perspectives on the Chinese presence in Africa. While some people thought it was good and we were getting all this infrastructure and we have opportunities that we never had before, others felt, of course, that it wasn't good. And basically, the argument that it was good was because, okay, China has brought in jobs to Africa, but those jobs are low paying. And there was one person saying that, well, if China didn't bring these jobs, we would all be unemployed. And then there was another saying, how is this truly helping us if the wages are so low? And the first thing that came to my mind was, why do they have to choose between the two extremes of being unemployed or working for low wages? Like, there must be a median somewhere. But my question is basically from, like, talking to the people that you've spoken to and watching the news that comes from Africa and just your experience being there, what does it seem that the African goal is? Do they have goals to be a world power or not? Because you stated that China realized if they wanted to be a world power, they couldn't just accept aid from other countries. They had to become an investor themselves. And from what it seems that China is doing in Africa is they're investing in themselves. They're investing in Chinese expansion, and Africa is just kind of getting the byproducts of that expansion, but it's not necessarily Africa's expansion. So does Africa want to be a world power? And if so, and if they're marketing like to their people that they want to be a world power, are they being transparent? Because I feel like anyone can see that if you're allowing another country to come in, have businesses, and pay your people low-paying wages, that's helping them and not your country. So I just want to know, what do they really want to do?
Right, so there's an awful lot to chew on in this question, and I could actually probably give a whole talk just in response, okay? But they're not going to allow me to do that. So I'm going to try to pick up on a couple of things. First of all, Africa is 54 countries. Africa is not a country, right? I know you know that technically, but in a continent of 54 countries, there's not a whole lot of countries, even with the best leadership that you could dream of, that could realistically aspire to becoming a superpower, right? So we're talking about 54 countries, and that means really there's only a very small number of pretty big countries in Africa. What do I mean by big? I mostly mean population-wise. So Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, I gave you the demographics of Africa over the coming century, the rest of the century, right? By the middle of the century, Nigeria is going to have more people than the United States. By the end of this century, Nigeria, somebody Google this for me, will you, on your phone? What is the surface area of Nigeria? Is it compared to an American state? Is it big? It's bigger than Texas? Is it smaller than Alaska, I think? Let's figure out. By the end of this century, Nigeria is going to have 850 million people. That's almost 1 billion people. Right, so Nigeria, conceivably, a country like Nigeria, and there are a few other big countries. Ethiopia is a big country. Okay, there's some other somewhat smaller but still big countries, Algeria, Sudan. Most African countries are really small countries in the scheme of things. Cumulatively, Africa is big, but most African countries are small countries, right? So let's put the superpower thing in perspective, and I want to flow from that to say that the thing I really like about your question, and I think is really important to this topic, is you said the Chinese are looking after Chinese interests. They're doing this for China. That is absolutely correct. That's absolutely 300% correct. Chinese people have a rhetoric about we want to be brothers with them and we want to walk hand in hand and this is win-win. That's a very common favorite phrase, blah, 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 blah. That's diplomatic language. The job of China's leaders is to seek wealth and power for China. That's their main job. And you can have whatever feeling you think of about China, right? But that's what most big countries' leaders are trying to do. Have wealth and power for their country, right? And so the outcome or the outcomes for African countries will depend to a substantial extent upon the degree to which the elites of those African countries can formulate and execute policies that really promote the national interests of those countries. And Africa, being 54 countries, has a wide variety of situations, of countries that are complete messes, where the elites are just ripping people off, systematically, to countries that are reasonably well run, to a small number of countries that are actually quite well run, right? And the outcomes that one can expect in these countries will depend to a very large extent on the quality and the behavior of their elites, right? And nobody coming from anywhere else, whatever they may tell you, whether it's China or the United States or Europe or wherever, is going to change that. Like, they're not going to come fix it for you. It's just not going to happen. Nobody ever developed anybody else for the needs of the other people. If they went somewhere to do something, they did it for their own purpose. If something good happened to you along the way, that's great. But that's usually because you made sure something good was going to happen for you, right? That's the basic background of your question, right? I guess I want to say one other thing about the balkanization of Africa. Africa is 54 countries. This is a tremendous historical hit that Africa has taken due to imperialism and colonization. Having 54 little cookie-cutter countries, most of which are tiny and, is extremely costly to Africa and extremely hard to overcome, right? Each little country has to have its own president, its own national assembly, its own giant bureaucracy, its own inefficient port and border, and its own, all of these systems reproduced at a local level with no overriding sense of regionalism or integration is incredibly costly to Africa. So you may even have an elite that's very responsible and is thinking very carefully about national interests, but you're carrying a huge penalty, and I'm not making an excuse. I think this is just a description of reality. You're carrying a huge penalty that is the legacy of this history. If you are a landlocked country, Africa has 54 countries, 17 of them are landlocked. Africans didn't create those countries, Europeans did. They drew those lines, and now we're stuck with them. Being a landlocked country is like having a 20% tax on your GDP every year forever. So you try really hard to develop, right? And you're thinking the best policies, and if you're lucky, you have an elite that's not corrupt at all, and they're working overtime, right? You got to overcome a 20% tax forever just because somebody drew a line like that and left you in the situation of a Zambia or a Botswana or Burkina Faso or Niger or Chad. These are some landlocked countries. They just got to carry that forever. So this is complicated stuff, and there's not easy answers. But it begins with, as is implicit in your question, taking care of oneself as best as one can first, right? And not being naive about what somebody else is going to bring you.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. Very informative. I kind of want you to follow up a little bit. You've touched on it in terms of elites and some of the problems in these countries. In a broader perspective, what degree do you think political corruption and terrorism has in terms of affecting this relationship, especially since 9/11, things like that?
Which relationship?
Between China and Africa. As China looks into Africa and looks at some of these various countries, and there's been this kind of history of political corruption, you see the potential for terrorism. You speak, for example, you talked about Nigeria, Boko Haram, and the emergence of these kind of, terrorist organizations. How do the Chinese view that in terms of where and how they're going to invest when that kind of threat is looming out there?
Thank you. So I think the United States is peculiar in the sense that its policy toward Africa is dominated by terrorism. The United States does not generally think about Africa still, even though China discovered this in the 1990s, as an economic space. The United States thinks of Africa more or less in terms of the stereotypes we discussed at the beginning. So it's a little less cartoonized, right? There's not lions running in the street after you, but the United States thinks of Africa as this place where you get epidemics and you have famines and you have, poverty and state failure and terrorism. And these are the things that need to kind of concentrate the minds of Americans about Africa. That's pretty much the extent of the United States picture of Africa. Most of Africa, overwhelmingly most of Africa, is not characterized by those problems, right? And so to the extent we remain shoehorned politically in this country into that kind of narrow perspective, we, by way of our government, are failing to understand that Africa is many other things, and it's in fact mostly other things. And we're failing to understand how we should be training generations of young students and of business people to think about Africa the way that China started thinking about Africa in the 1990s, as this place where there's this incredible demographic thing taking place, yes, which has some risks, but yes, which also has huge opportunities, right? That's simply not happening in this country, right? And so the Chinese, I don't think, are naive about Africa, that there's terrorism or that there's corruption, but they're not blinded by those things. They see Africa as being variegated, that there's all sorts of stuff in Africa, and so you look for, here's the stuff that interests us, that we can work with, that we feel most comfortable with, and we're not going to let the other stuff completely blind us to these other qualities and characteristics and opportunities. On corruption, I would say that corruption is a very big problem in China also. I should also say, probably taking a step further back, corruption's a big problem everywhere. Africa has been treated unfairly with regard to the question of corruption. Western corporations have been treating Africa corruptly for a very long time. Imperialism and the slave trade and colonization are themselves corruption, right? So to think now suddenly that we're in the modern era and we must hold our noses and we can't get involved with those people because they're so corrupt is a very, very self-indulgent way of thinking about the world, right? And in my view, is completely unwarranted. This is not to say that corruption is not a problem for Africa. Corruption is a problem for Africa. Africa needs elites that are going to relentlessly pursue national interest, And it doesn't have enough of those elites yet. So I'm not minimizing this problem. I'm trying to place this problem in a broader perspective. Now, to speak about China, China itself has a huge corruption problem. The Chinese state says that itself. The Chinese leader now, Xi Jinping, is one of his sort of hallmark policies is an anti-corruption drive, right? He doesn't go around generally talking about China has corruption problems in its business overseas. He's mostly talking about China domestically, right? But China has corruption problems overseas also. China doesn't have a tradition of rule of law like we have in this country and European countries generally tend to have. It doesn't have anything like a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which we have in this country, imperfect as it is, but which is not known in many other parts of the world, right? And so the Chinese go to various African countries, whether it's state companies or whether it's individual entrepreneurs, and they do whatever they can to make money. And part of that is because they're comfortable with certain levels of corruption, and part of that is because the elites in those countries that are running those countries are not themselves prosecuting corruption in any serious way, right? So it's sort of more or less like what the traffic will bear is what you do if you're from China, right? You asked about Boko Haram. I don't think that Boko Haram is that Chinese are particularly wrapped up with Boko Haram. That China does a great amount of trade and big project work in Nigeria, and Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, and China says, I think, at a high policy level, come hell or high water, including Boko Haram, we're going to be really engaged with Nigeria. This is big.
Thank you, Howard. My question is about a small history. Today we talk about China, Africa, or China, or Africa, China, the economic, technological engagement, and people tend to think about China is like a benefactor. China helps, right, teaches. But in the 1960s and the early 70s, it was Taiwan was doing a lot of economic and technological projects, especially in western part of Africa. And one project they focus is rice cultivation. They show how to raise that, and all of those Taiwanese agricultural works technicians, they worked very, very hard there. In the same time, the mainland China is doing the same thing, but focus more on technology like railway, road construction in eastern part of Africa, right? So they are competing. And my question is, actually United States secretly funded Taiwan's project in Western Africa. My question is, in your African experience, have you encountered anything, any person, any reading or any whatever that still shows kind of historical memory still there related to the Taiwanese assistance, okay, in the 70s, in the entire 60s? Or you encountered nothing, like that part of history completely faded away? That's my question.
Sure. Thank you. So I didn't, this was not a focus of my own work, but I'm aware of this historical experience and of some of the literature on it. There is a very well-known book by a woman named Deborah Brodickham, which you may know of, called The Dragon's Gift, which talks a little bit about, that's not its main topic, and I have some issues with that book, but it talks a little bit about I think it's good, yeah. The earlier Taiwan experience in Africa. That in many cases, the People's Republic of China, meaning Beijing, over time as it supplanted Taiwan in various African countries, it actually picked up it took over some of the Taiwanese projects. I think it's important to understand the difference in Taiwan's priority in engaging Africa in the 70s and 80s and China's priority in engaging Africa now. Taiwan's main purpose was not, I don't believe, going out into the world for the purpose of globalizing and making money and sustaining Taiwan's development. I think Taiwan's priority was soft power. That Taiwan needed, first and foremost, Taiwan is an island off of mainland China that mainland China says belongs to mainland China. And Taiwan says, no, we don't belong to mainland China. We want to live autonomously from you, right? And so this is a long-term historical dispute and potentially conflict between these two places, right? With China claiming Taiwan belongs to it and that it must return to the fold, right? So Taiwan's priority all along has been having other countries recognize it. And Taiwan has been willing historically to spend a lot of money providing aid to mostly to smaller countries around the world on the premise that if it does benevolent seeming things in these places, then these places will extend diplomatic recognition to Taiwan and that will fulfill Taiwan's priority in terms of sustaining its independence or autonomy from mainland China. So that's what Taiwan was doing. It was an aid-based but soft power and diplomatically oriented strategy of engaging Africa. Mainland China has come more recently into the scene seeking to develop China by developing opportunities outside of China for business, as I've said. And you mentioned infrastructure and big projects like that, which are in contrast to these Taiwanese demonstration projects and things like rice farming techniques, et cetera, et cetera. China's big project development work is not aid. Mainland China today does not give a lot of aid. And I'm not saying that because it's good or because it's bad. I'm saying that because it's a fact. There's a lot of confusion around the very term aid. China builds lots of things in Africa, and it does so predominantly on a commercial basis. China has big state banks, which are known as policy banks, meaning the central government tells them what the policy is, and they have to go out and they have to execute that policy. China has these big state banks which lend commercially to African countries to fulfill or to finance big projects like the stadiums I talked about earlier, or highways, or ports, or airports, or housing units, or whatever, right? And these banks are lending commercially with the idea that they should make a profit. That's what commercial lending means. This is part of China's big business push with the world. Having big state policy banks that are extending billions and billions of dollars in loans all around the world, which are not aid, but are meant to reap a profit, right? And they reap a profit in many different ways. Some of them highly unconventional from the perspective, if you think about Western banks. Western banks operate, yes, they want to reap a profit too, but their profit is a bookmaking profit. Like, so we lend $1.2 billion over 30 years at an X interest rate, and so that's how we calculate our profit, right? That's the conventional way you think of a commercial bank reckoning its profit. Chinese development banks, because they're policy banks, meaning the state that owns them and is telling them what to do, have a different calculus. Their calculus begins with those routine, kind of traditional commercial considerations. X number of dollars, X number of years, X interest rate. Okay, you can do the math. Here's how much money we'll make. But the state, which is behind all of this, has additional factors of profitability which it factors in. When a Chinese state bank, one of these policy banks, lends the money to an African country to build a highway system or a railway system or a port or whatever, they have to use a Chinese company to do the work. And these Chinese companies are also state companies. And so the bank is lending at 6 or whatever % interest rate, which is a commercial rate, and it's going to get the traditional yield on that investment. And on top of that, another Chinese company is going to execute the project during the construction. And so that money's coming back to China in yet another way, not just via the interest rate, but via the contract business that the state-owned construction company or engineering company is going to sign with a given country. And there's yet 2 more ways the money's coming back to China, so which also factor into this unconventional sense of profitability. As I described in my stadium building example, the workers are going to be predominantly Chinese. So not only is the contract with the engineering company going to be a Chinese state company, but the very workers who execute the project are going to be predominantly Chinese, and they're going to be paid in China. Their money's not even going to leave the country. It's going to be paid in China, and so that's another way of thinking about the profitability of these things that is totally outside of the practices of a Western bank when it makes a commercial loan. The final way is that the critical materials in a project, a rail, a port, an airport, whatever, they're all going to be sourced in China. So the steel's going to be sourced in China, the optical fiber is going to be sourced in China, the cell phone towers are going to be sourced in China, the cement is going to be sourced in China, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this money is flowing back to China one way or another at various different levels in ways that mean that the normal commercial Citibank lends $1.2 billion at 6% over 30 years, and it gives you X amount of profit, right? The Chinese calculation is totally different from that, even though it starts from a commercial lending perspective.
Okay, thank you. We're out of time. Perhaps we will entertain some of your questions during the lunch hour. So thank you again, Professor French, for this very illuminating talk about China and Africa, and really imploring everyone to think about not only their relationship with Africa, but the world. Thank you.